The sun broke pale and cold over Blackwater Falls, spilling thin light across trampled earth and furious faces. 4 girls stood on wobbling crates beneath a rough beam lashed between 2 cottonwood trees. The ropes around their necks bit deep hemp fibers dark against skin, already bruised from rough handling. Their bare feet trembled above the ground. Behind them, draped across a wagon bed under a stained blanket, lay the stiff body of old Joseph, the gray-bearded mail driver, who had carried letters and small kindnesses to half the town for a decade. Blood soaked the front of his coat, a dark blossom that had dried into stiff folds. The townsfolk surged around the cottonwoods like a living noose miners with dirt under their nails, ranch hands still smelling of horse sweat, shopkeepers clutching tools like weapons. Rage and grief twisted their faces into masks barely recognizable. A bounty hunter they called Dead-Eye Dick flicked his cigarette into the earth and thumbed back the hammer of his revolver with a casual air, as if he were about to shoot a rabbit instead of watch children die. He grinned yellowed teeth, showing a scar running from his left eye to his jaw, a mark from a knife fight years ago. "Let us see justice done." He drawled, his voice carrying over the murmur of the crowd, his tone dripping with malice. Schoolteacher Catherine Doyle shoved through the press of bodies, her skirts brushing mud and boot prints, her voice raw from shouting. "They are children." She cried, her words cracking like dry wood. "You cannot hang children on a rumor and call it law." A miner's fist slammed into her shoulder, and she went hard to her knees, the breath knocked from her lungs. Hands grabbed at her arms, dragging her back from the crates. The sheriff stood 10 paces away, he's fixed on the ground, hands folded behind his back. He said nothing. He said, beside him, mine owner, Horatio Pike, lifted one hand toward the beam, a gesture as lazy as a man swatting a fly. His eyes were cold, satisfied. Moments before, he had been glancing toward his foreman Grit and toward Dr. Abraham Cole, who stood near the wagon with his medical bag, his face unreadable. A wordless exchange that lingered just a heartbeat too long. Something calculated, something rehearsed. On a nearby hitch rail, one of the saddle horses stamped and tossed its head. A paint mare with a distinct Lakota brand burned into her flank, the mark of a people he claimed to despise. From the cottonwood shadows by the river, a man stepped forward, leading another paint pony by a length of rope. He wore buckskin trousers stained dark with travel, a faded cavalry shirt taken from a dead soldier years ago, and moccasins soft enough to walk silent over stone. His hair hung long and black, tied back with a strip of leather. His face was lean, weathered, carved by wind and hardship. His name was Maka, called Lone Wolf, by white men who either feared him or admired him from a distance. He took in the scene with eyes that missed nothing. And the dead mail driver, the ropes, the branded mare he had been tracking for 2 days, the 4 terrified girls whose names he did not yet know, Juliana, Rosalie, Sonia, and Cordelia. He walked into the circle of guns, his stride unhurried despite the limp that marked an old wound, his expression carved from shadow. His voice cut through the murmur like a blade drawn slow from a sheath. "Not today." Dead-Eye Dick sneered, spat, and kicked the smallest girl's crate. The wood tilted. Cordelia's small body dropped the rope, snapping tight, her feet thrashing in empty air. Maka moved his horse, surging forward, his knife flashing up the crates, tipping as men shouted and grabbed for him. And the hanging tree erupted into chaos, swinging ropes, the crack of gunfire, and the thunder of hooves on hard ground. The day before, on the morning of Tuesday, September 14th, Blackwater Falls was all clamor and industry. Ore wagons creaked in from the silver mine on the hillside, their wheels groaning under the weight of rock and hope. The telegraph clicked in a cramped office above the general store, sending messages east about payroll deliveries and ore shipments. A muddy river bent around the town, and the only broad water for 50 miles, lined with willows and cottonwoods that gave the place its only shade. The town smelled of sweat horse manure, gunpowder, and the sharp tang of crushed silver ore. On the prairie beyond town, Maka rode low in his saddle, following a line of tracks pressed into the dry earth. 3 Lakota ponies had been stolen from his band 2 nights ago, horses bred careful, trained, gentle, stolen by men who saw them only as profit. He read the ground with eyes that had learned to see what others missed. Hoof marks, overlapping wheel ruts, cigarette ash scattered near a waterhole. A torn piece of canvas snagged on sagebrush. The trail led toward Whirlwind Pass, a narrow gorge where stone walls funneled travelers and trouble alike through a single choke point. He had been tracking for a day and a half, sleeping light, eating jerky and hardtack from his saddlebag. His body carried the map of old fights, a scar across his left thigh from a cavalry saber 5 years back, another across his ribs from a barroom brawl he had not started, but finished. He was 32 years old, lean and hard as the land he rode, with a reputation among his people as a man who kept his word, and among white men as someone best left alone. In an immigrant camp near the river, canvas tents leaned against the skeleton of a broken wagon. Juliana, 17 years old, with sharp eyes and a lean, hungry look, tried to boil thin soup over a fire that would not catch properly. Rosalie, 15, joked to keep Sonia, 13, and Cordelia, 10, from noticing how little was in the pot. They had lost their parents to fever on the long journey west, first their mother in July, then their father a week later in early August, leaving Juliana to hold the family together with nothing but stubbornness and the faint hope of washing jobs in town, mind laundry, maybe a place indoors when winter came. "We will manage," Juliana said quietly, stirring the thin broth with a wooden spoon. "We have before. We always do." Rosalie forced a smile, trying to lighten the mood. "Tomorrow I will ask at the boarding house again. They need someone to scrub floors. They told me so last week." Cordelia hugged her knees, her small face pale and drawn. "I miss Mama. I miss Papa." "I know," Juliana whispered, pulling her sister close, feeling the small body shake with silent sobs. "I know. But they would want us to keep going. They would want us to survive." Old Joseph, the mail driver, brought them stale biscuits and peppermint candy whenever his route allowed. The children of Blackwater Falls raced his wagon for letters from distant kin. Even the roughest miner tipped his hat when the old man passed. He had kind eyes, a beard gone gray, and a voice that never rose above what was needed. He told Juliana once that her parents would have been proud of how she held on. Catherine Doyle, a widowed Civil War nurse, turned schoolteacher, brought a basket of bread to the camp after her classes ended that afternoon. She wore a simple gray dress with a high collar, her skirts practical, and mended her hands, still bearing the faint scars of surgical work done in field tents. She drilled the girls in English beside the cottonwoods, correcting Juliana's careful reading, guiding Cordelia's small hand over letters scratched in the earth with a stick. War had taught Catherine what happened when no one fought for the small and voiceless. She had watched boys die for want of clean bandages and men hang for the color of their coats. She had sworn in the blood-soaked tents of Gettysburg that she would never again stand by and let injustice pass unchallenged. "Read the next line," Catherine instructed gently, pointing to the page of a tattered primer. Juliana squinted at the words. "The man walks to the house." "Very good. Now, Cordelia, you try." In the saloon, Horatio Pike complained over whiskey, about foreign mouths and Indians drinking from his river. He planned to expand his stamp mill and bring a railroad spur through town, but poor farmer Lucas Moran grazed cattle along the very meadows he wanted. Horatio wanted all of it at land-water tracts, and he was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted one way or another. He wore a tailored coat and boots polished to a mirror, shined a man who did not dig ore himself, but profited from the sweat of those who did. Dr. Abraham Cole sat at a corner table sipping whiskey, slowly, his medical bag at his feet. He was a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and graying hair, respected in town for his skill with a scalpel and his calm demeanor during emergencies. He listened to Horatio's complaints with a neutral expression, occasionally nodding. What few noticed was the way his eyes followed Horatio's gestures, the way he leaned in when Horatio spoke of land acquisitions, and the way his hand trembled slightly when he reached for his glass. "Lucas Moran will sell," Horatio said to his foreman Grit in a low voice that barely carried over the noise of the saloon. "After tomorrow, he will have no choice. Fear drives better bargains than gold." Grit nodded, his scarred face impassive. "And the Indian problem?" "Handled," Horatio replied, taking a sip of whiskey. "The horses I acquired will tie the story together nicely. 3 Lakota ponies with brands visible. No one will question it." Dr. Cole shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening imperceptibly. He had provided Horatio with information about old Joseph's route schedule, and the timing of the payroll wagon information gathered during house calls whispered in confidence by the old driver himself. The guilt gnawed at him, but debts had a way of binding men tighter than rope. Horatio held a promissory note for $5,000 money Cole had borrowed to pay for his late wife's medical treatments in Denver. The note was due, and Cole had no way to pay. It was a brief exchange easy to miss in the noise of the saloon, but significant like the first crack in ice before a river breaks. Deputy Paul Gibbons, a former ranch hand whose brother had died in a skirmish with Lakota riders 3 years back, wore his badge tight and drank too much. He clung to Horatio's patronage like a drowning man clings to driftwood, and he let anger at savages fill the hole grief had left. He was not a cruel man by nature, but grief and whiskey had bent him into a shape he no longer recognized. Maka's path and theirs were about to cross in a canyon, where stone walls made lies echo louder than truth. That evening, Catherine sat with the girls by the fire, reading aloud from a tattered copy of A Penny Dreadful about outlaws and sheriffs. Cordelia leaned against her shoulder, half asleep. Juliana watched the fire, her mind calculating how many more days of soup they could stretch before someone had to beg work from the mine foreman, or worse. Rosalie sang a soft song in their mother tongue, and Sonia hummed along, their voices blending with the crackle of flames. Across town, Maka camped alone. Under the stars, his horse picketed nearby. He checked the tracks again by moonlight, memorizing the rhythm of the stolen pony's gaits, the way one favored its left foreleg. Tomorrow, he would reach Whirlwind Pass. Tomorrow, he would take back what was stolen, or he would die trying. It was a simple equation, the kind his life had taught him to solve without hesitation. In the saloon, Horatio leaned close to Grit, the lamplight casting long shadows across their faces. "The payroll wagon leaves at dawn on Wednesday," Horatio murmured. "Make it look like savages and foreigners. Blame the girls from the camp, blame the Indian if you see one. Just make sure old Joseph does not come back. He knows too much about the land deals." Grit drained his whiskey and left without a word, disappearing into the night. The pieces were all in place, moving toward collision like stones rolling downhill. Near midday, on Wednesday, September 15th, Maka reached Whirlwind Pass. The canyon walls rose steep and red on either side, striped with layers of ancient stone. He dismounted, leading his horse along a narrow ledge that clung to the rock face above the main road. Below, he heard the creak of wagon wheels and the plodding rhythm of mules. Old Joseph's wagon crawled between the stone wall's mailbags, piled high beside a locked payroll chest, bound for Horatio's mine. The old man sat hunched on the seat, reins loose in his hands, humming a tune Maka could not quite hear. Ahead, among the rocks on the opposite side of the pass, horses waited in the shadows, 5, maybe 6. Men with scarves pulled over their faces, crouched behind boulders, rifles already raised. Maka's gut tightened. He recognized one of the horses immediately, a blue roan mare with his people's brand stolen along with the paints. His jaw set hard. He opened his mouth to shout a warning, but the distance was too great, and the wind too loud, carrying his voice away into the canyon. The first shot cracked like a whip. Old Joseph jerked, clutching his chest, his face going slack with shock. He toppled sideways from the seat, hitting the road hard, the breath leaving him in a rush. The mules screamed and reared, tangling their harness. A second shot boomed. One of the masked riders, his hat sitting low and crooked, fired again into the old man's back to make absolutely sure. Blood pooled dark and fast in the earth beneath him. Maka drew his rifle and fired, the report echoing off stone. One of the riders yelped and dropped his gun, grabbing his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. The others turned bullets, answering in a storm of noise. Lead chipped stone near Maka's head, and a splinter of rock gouged his left thigh where an old cavalry wound lay beneath the skin. The sharp edge sliced through buckskin and flesh, and agony stabbed hot and deep, stealing his breath. He staggered back, dragging his horse into a narrow crease in the rock, his legs screaming with every movement. Below, the riders pried open the payroll chest with a crowbar, their movements practiced and efficient. They pocketed a handful of coins to make the theft look authentic, then slammed it shut again. They lashed old Joseph's body back onto the wagon, with rough hands smearing extra blood over the boards for show. One of them, Grit, though the scarf hid most of his face, tied Maka's stolen horses to the back of the wagon and drove the whole gruesome parade toward Blackwater Falls, leaving only wheel ruts and spent shell casings behind. Maka breathed hard, fury and anguish warring in his chest. He pressed his palm against the bleeding gash in his thigh, feeling the old scar tissue split beneath the new wound. 6 armed men in a narrow pass. He was skilled, but he was not invincible. If he charged down there alone, he would die, and no one would know the truth. Instead, he noted every detail with the precision of a hunter, the limp of one rider as he mounted the way. Another's hat sat low over his brow, and the brand marks on the horses, the chest they chose to leave mostly intact instead of emptying it completely. Details mattered. Details would be the difference between justice and another rope. By sunset, he was in sight of town, his leg throbbing with every step his horse took. From a distance, he saw Horatio standing by the bloody wagon, arms raised, whipping up a crowd, as old Joseph's body was laid out on a table outside the saloon. Men gathered, their voices rising in anger like a swarm of hornets disturbed. Horatio's words carried on the wind, each syllable calculated to inflame. 4 girls seen near the pass. Lakota scout must have helped them. Blood calls for blood. Catherine arrived just in time to see 4 girls dragged from the immigrant camp by men with rough hands and hard faces. Juliana fought, kicking and biting until someone struck her across the face, splitting her lip. Rosalie wrapped her arms around Sonia and Cordelia, trying to shield them, her voice breaking as she begged, "Please, we did nothing. We were at the camp all morning." The crowd accused them of luring Joseph into a trap, of stealing the payroll, of conspiring with savages. The sheriff muttered something about waiting for a judge, his voice weak and unconvincing, but Horatio's voice drowned him out. Joseph was family to this town. Horatio roared, his face flushed with righteous fury, his fists raised. The law is too far away. Blood calls for blood. By dark, men were cutting timber and lashing a beam between 2 cottonwoods. Maka watched from the shadows, his hand pressed tight against his bleeding thigh, and knew the rope was meant to cover another rope tied in Whirlwind Pass, a rope woven from lies, greed, and calculated murder. He had tracked stolen horses. He had found a crime far worse. Dawn came cold and gray on Thursday, September 16th. The 4 girls stood on crates beneath the beam ropes, looped around their necks, wrists bound behind their backs with coarse hemp. Old Joseph's wagon sat nearby like an altar, his hat laid carefully on the blanket covering his body. The townsfolk gathered in a tight circle, their breath steaming in the chill air. Grief had twisted into something ugly and eager, a beast that fed on itself. Horatio stood on a crate of his own, pointing at the girls with one hand, his voice rising and falling like a preacher at a revival. He delivered letters to your children. He shouted, his voice carrying over the murmur. He carried medicine to your sick, and they repaid him with a bullet in the back. The crowd roared. Grief turned to fuel for vengeance, each shout building on the last until the noise was deafening. Catherine fought through them, grabbing at sleeves, shoving against shoulders with all her strength. "You have no proof. She cried, her voice cracking with desperation. "You have only words shouted over a dead man. Where is your evidence? Where is your witness?" She reached the girls' crates, her hands shaking as she tried to wedge herself between them and the ropes. A miner's shove sent her stumbling her knees, hitting the earth hard enough to bruise bone. Dead-Eye Dick stepped up, spurs jingling with each step, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "Hanging is too kind," he muttered, but his eyes gleamed with anticipation and the look of a man who enjoyed his work. He nudged Cordelia's crate with the toe of his boot, testing its balance. The little girl whimpered, tears streaming down her face, her small body shaking like a leaf in a storm. "Please," Cordelia whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, I am scared. I want my mama." Maka stood at the edge of the cottonwood shadows, one hand gripping his horse's reins, the other pressed against his throbbing thigh. He saw the dead driver. He could not save the stolen mare, tied in a vigilante's string, and the 4 small figures about to die, because Horatio needed a story to cover his crime. His leg throbbed with every heartbeat, the wound fresh and angry, but anguish was not new to him. He had learned long ago to move through it, to push past the body's protests when something greater was at stake. He stepped into the circle of guns, his stride steady despite the limp that marked each step, his face set like stone. "Not today," he said, his voice low, but cutting through the noise like a blade through silk. Men turned hands, going to pistols and rifles. Dead-Eye sneered his lips, pulling back from yellow teeth, the scar on his face twisting. "Then when Injun," he drawled, his voice dripping with contempt. He kicked Cordelia's crate hard. The wood tilted, then fell. Cordelia dropped the rope, snapping tight around her small neck, her feet thrashing in empty air, her face already darkening as the noose choked the life from her. Maka spurred his horse hard. The animal lunged forward, hooves pounding, slamming into Dead-Eye's shoulder and sending the bounty hunter crashing into another man. Both went down in a tangle of limbs. Maka's knife flashed up the blade, catching morning light, and he sliced Cordelia's rope just as her eyes began to roll back, the whites showing. She fell into his arms, coughing and gasping, her tiny fingers clawing at the burned groove on her neck, desperate for air. Sonia's crate tipped as men grabbed for Maka's reins, trying to pull him down. Catherine lunged, grabbing the noose with both hands, her teeth bared in a snarl of effort as she fought the pull of the rope, taking Sonia's weight on her own shoulders. "Hold still," she gasped to the girl, her muscles screaming with effort as she bore the burden. Maka swung his knife again, cutting Sonia free just above Catherine's white knuckles. For a heartbeat, their eyes locked, hers full of raw, desperate anger, his of grim, unyielding focus. There was no softness in it, no poetry, but something passed between them in that instant recognition of another person who would not step back when stepping back was easier, when stepping back was safer. Gunfire erupted, deafening and chaotic. A bullet grazed Maka's upper arm, spinning him halfway around, warm blood soaking his sleeve. Another ricocheted off the beam, sending splinters flying like tiny daggers. He grabbed Juliana and Rosalie, yanking them from their crates, shoving them toward his horse with desperate urgency. "Hold on," he barked to Juliana. "Do not let go." Deputy Paul Gibbons raised his revolver at the barrel's steady sights centered on Maka's chest. He saw the girls, saw old Joseph's hat lying on the wagon, heard Horatio's voice in his ear, urging him to shoot to end this defiance. His finger tightened on the trigger. Then he saw Cordelia's small face, the rope burn raw and red around her neck, and something inside him broke like a dam giving way. He jerked the barrel up and fired into the air. "Hold your fire!" he shouted, his voice cracking with confusion and doubt. "Hold your blasted fire." The moment of hesitation was all Maka needed. He hauled Juliana across the saddle, Cordelia clinging to his belt behind her, and barked at Catherine, "Can you ride?" "I can." She spat, swinging onto a loose horse with Sonia in front of her, ignoring the bruise blooming purple on her shoulder from the crowd's rough treatment. They smashed through the ring of men horses, plunging forward as men dove aside or fired wildly bullets, whining past like angry hornets. One shot tore a hot line across Maka's ribs, the agony bright and immediate, searing like a brand. Another splintered a cottonwood branch, sending leaves raining down like green snow. Behind them, Horatio roared for a posse for their heads, for blood to answer blood. They raced for the river, the horses' hooves pounding hard on the packed earth, the sound like war drums echoing across the prairie. The river met them in a rush of cold water and slick stones. The horses plunged in at a shallow bend, water swirling around their legs, manes flying foam flecking their necks. Cordelia clung to Maka's belt, coughing and shaking her small hands, white-knuckled with terror. Juliana bit her lip until blood ran rather than cry out, her hands gripping the saddle horn until her knuckles went white as bone. On the far bank, the land opened into rolling prairie, waist-high grass, bending under the wind, hiding them from the town rifles. Maka led them east, following a dry creek bed that cut through the hills like a scar. His arm bled steadily, soaking his sleeve, the fabric sticking to his skin. His ribs burned where the bullet had kissed flesh, each breath a reminder of how close death had come. His thigh throbbed with every jolt of the horse's gait, the wound reopening with the movement. He said nothing, his jaw set, his eyes scanning the horizon for pursuit, always watching, always calculating. They reached an old line shack by midday, a one-room shelter used by cowhands during roundup, now abandoned and sagging under the weight of neglect. Inside, layers of grime lay thick over a broken bunk and a rusted stove. Cobwebs hung in the corners like ghostly curtains. Maka cut the girl's wrist ropes with his knife, his hands steady despite the agony coursing through his body. Catherine splashed water from a rain barrel over their bruised necks, her touch gentle but efficient. But the nurse in her taking over without thought or hesitation. She did not ask if they were all right. She could see they were not. She asked instead, her voice calm and practical, "Can you walk if we need to run?" Juliana nodded, her jaw set with determination. "Yes, we will do what we must." Rosalie took Sonia's hand, squeezing tight. "We can." Cordelia stared at the floor, her small fingers tracing the rope burn on her throat, the skin raw and blistered. She said nothing, her eyes wide and haunted. Maka tore a strip from his shirt and pressed it against his bleeding arm, his hand shaking slightly with blood loss and shock. Catherine moved toward him, without asking permission this time, her hands already reaching. "Let me," she said quietly, her voice firm. "I have done this many times before. I was a nurse in the war." Maka met her eyes, searching for something, pity perhaps, or judgment. He found neither. He nodded once, a short, reluctant permission. She worked quickly, checking the wound, cleaning it with water from a canteen, her fingers sure and practiced. The bullet had carved a shallow groove, but had not lodged. "You were fortunate," she said, wrapping it with torn linen from her petticoat. "Another inch, and it would have shattered bone." "Fortune has little to do with it," Maka replied, his voice low. "Only timing. And stubbornness," Catherine added, tying off the bandage with a firm knot. Their fingers touched briefly, and neither pulled away immediately. The contact was brief, but deliberate an acknowledgement of shared danger and mutual respect. "You did not have to step between me and that rope," Maka said after a moment, his eyes fixed on the wall. Catherine paused and then met his gaze. "Yes, I did. I watched too many die in the war because no one would stand up. I will not watch it again." Maka considered her words, then nodded slowly. "You are braver than most men I have known. And you are more foolish than most." Catherine replied, but there was no heat in her words, only the faint trace of a smile. By nightfall, they reached a small Lakota camp, by a bend in the river, a place Maka trusted. 2 families took the girls in without questions, laying them near the fire, pressing bowls of broth into their trembling hands. Suspicion hung in the air like smoke. Bringing white trouble to the camp was dangerous, a risk that could bring soldiers or vigilantes down on them all. But Maka's words still carried weight among his people. He told Catherine Lucas Moran, who had ridden after them, torn between fear and a fragile sense of what was right, and later Dr. Abraham Cole, who arrived with a lantern and a battered medical satchel, his face pale and drawn. What he had seen in Whirlwind Pass, the stolen tribal horses, the scarfed riders, the second shot into old Joseph's back, to make certain he was dead, and the way they staged the scene with deliberate care. "You saw this and did not shoot them all down?" Lucas asked, his voice sharp with fear and frustration, his hands shaking as he spoke. Maka met his eyes without flinching. 6 rifles. 1 of me. If I die there, you still hang 4 children in the morning. I chose to live and fight another way." The logic was brutal and unanswerable, a cold calculation that left no room for heroics. Lucas looked away, shame coloring his face. "I am sorry. I should not have questioned you." Dr. Cole examined Maka's wounds under the firelight, his fingers probing gently but firmly, his expression grim. His hands trembled slightly as he worked, and Catherine noticed. "Arm will heal if you do not tear it open again." Cole muttered, wrapping a clean bandage with practiced efficiency. "Leg is another story. That old scar with this new wound opening it. You try running hard, you may not stay upright. You understand what I am saying?" Maka nodded. He understood. He had bought time and saved 4 lives, but he had traded part of his strength to do it a bargain with consequences he would carry forward. Cole avoided eye contact at his guilt a visible weight. He had given Horatio the information about Joseph's route. He had betrayed a man he called friend. The knowledge ate at him like acid. Later that night, thunder rumbled far off, a low growl across the prairie that promised rain. The Lakota camp darkened its lanterns when riders passed on the far ridge, Horatio's men, hunting like wolves in the night. Maka and Catherine crouched behind an overturned wagon, a Winchester rifle between them, watching the silhouettes move against the skyline, like shadows against the stars. He showed her how to top off the magazine, his larger hand closing over hers to guide the motion, their shoulders almost touching in the cramped space. Each click of a cartridge sliding home was a quiet pact. He trusted her not to panic when the shooting started. She trusted him to know when to shoot and when to hold fire. The riders passed by, fooled by the darkened camp and the stillness, their voices fading into the distance. When the danger ebbed, both realized how close they were, how their hands had lingered together a moment longer than necessity demanded. Catherine did not pull away immediately this time. "My husband taught me to load a rifle before he went to war," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "He never came back. I swore I would never be helpless again." Maka listened, his expression thoughtful. "My wife died of fever 7 winters ago. She was carrying our first child. I was away hunting when it happened. I came back to find them both gone." Catherine's eyes softened with understanding. "I am sorry." "As am I," Maka replied. "But sorrow does not keep us alive. Only action does." They sat in silence for a moment, the shared grief, a bridge between them unspoken but deeply felt. Across the fire, Lucas confessed his debt to Horatio in a low, ashamed voice, each word dragged out reluctantly. He loaned me money to buy seed and cattle last spring. If I speak against him, he will take my land, my home, my wife, my children. We will have nothing. We will be beggars on the road. Paul Gibbons, who had followed them to the camp, his badge still pinned to his chest, but his eyes full of doubt, spoke up for the first time. I lost my brother to a Lakota raiding party 3 years ago. I have hated your people since then, he said, looking at Maka. But today, I saw you risk your life for children who are not your own, who are not even your people. I do not know what to believe anymore. Maka studied him for a long moment. Hate is easy. It asks nothing of you except to feel. But justice is hard. It asks you to think, to see, to choose what is right, even when it costs you. Paul looked away, his jaw working. I should have fired at you today. Horatio expected me to. But when I saw that little girl's face... You chose, Maka said simply. That is all any of us can do. Abraham Cole sat apart from the group, staring into the fire, his face drawn. Catherine noticed his discomfort and approached him quietly. You seem troubled, Doctor. Cole flinched, then forced a smile. Just tired. It has been a long day. Catherine did not press, but the seed of suspicion had been planted. In town, Deputy Paul had returned briefly before following them to the camp. He sat alone in the sheriff's office, staring at the nooses coiled in a corner, still smelling of hemp and sweat. He remembered how old Joseph used to slip him coffee on cold mornings, how the old man never asked why Paul drank so much, just offered the warmth without judgment or pity. Horatio's version of events bothered him in ways whiskey could not drown anymore, gnawing at his conscience like a rat in the walls. He had fired into the air instead of into Maka's chest. That single moment, that split-second choice, gnawed at him like a wolf on a bone. The night stretched long and uneasy, each person wrestling with choices made and choices to come. Hiding in the camp was not enough. The girls were fugitives. Maka was a wanted man, and Catherine was now counted among the lawless. To clear the girls and stop the next rope, they needed proof, solid, undeniable proof, that would turn the town's fury back toward the man who had orchestrated it, or proof that could not be ignored or explained away. Catherine knew where Horatio's power slept: his office, above the assay room, full of ledgers, telegraph logs, and the kind of secrets men like him kept locked away from prying eyes. On a wind-scraped night, 3 days after the hanging attempt on Sunday, September 19th, Maka, Catherine, Paul, and Lucas slipped back into Blackwater Falls under cover of darkness. Dr. Cole had volunteered to wait outside town with a wagon ready to run if things went wrong, though his hands shook as he prepared the horses. Paul, his conscience now driving him more. Then fear hovered in the dark alley below Horatio's stairs, his badge hidden under his coat, a revolver heavy in his hand, his heart pounding in his chest. If this goes wrong, he muttered to himself, I will have betrayed everyone. Catherine picked the office lock with a hairpin. Her breath held her fingers trembling slightly with nerves and adrenaline. Inside lamplight revealed shelves of books, a big desk cluttered with papers and ledgers, and a safe built into the wall behind a painting of a mountain range. The room smelled of cigar smoke and ink, the scent of power and calculation. They searched quickly, quietly, each movement deliberate. Maka's arm throbbed with each motion. His leg complained at any quick turn, the wound protesting every step. He was no invincible ghost, no legendary figure, just a wounded man moving, because stopping was worse than the agony coursing through his body. Behind a row of ledgers on the top shelf, Catherine found a slim, leather-bound telegraph log, and the pages yellowed with age and use. Dates and messages lined up in neat ink, each entry stamped with the telegrapher's initials. One entry stood out, dated Tuesday, September 14th, the day before the robbery. A wire from Horatio to an insurance agent in Denver, mentioning payment for a probable payroll loss, and a follow-up note about buying up riverside lots after incident resolves and undesirables depart. Probable loss. Catherine whispered, her voice tight with fury and disbelief. Before the wagon ever left town. He planned this from the beginning. In Horatio's private ledger, they found more damning evidence, each line a nail in his coffin payments to Dead-Eye Dick for consultation services rendered, line items labeled informants to identify foreign scapegoats for public action, and a note about acquiring Lucas Moran's river pasture once squatters and undesirable camps are cleared by public action and fear. But the most shocking discovery came in a separate, smaller ledger hidden beneath a loose floorboard. It was a record of debts and obligations, and one name leapt out at Catherine with chilling clarity: Dr. Abraham Cole, $5,000 due September 1st. And beneath it, in Horatio's neat handwriting, information provided Joseph's route schedule timing of payroll delivery camp locations. Debt forgiven upon completion. Catherine's hands shook as she held the page up to the light. Abraham. She whispered, her voice thick with betrayal and disbelief. He told Horatio everything. He is the one who made this possible. Maka's expression darkened, his jaw clenching. He came to the camp. He treated my wounds. He looked me in the eye and said nothing. Lucas staggered back, his face pale. We trusted him. We all trusted him. Paul cursed under his breath. He is waiting with the wagon. He could lead Horatio's men straight to us. Catherine's mind raced, torn between anger and calculation. We need this evidence, but we cannot let him know we know. Not yet. If we confront him now, he may run or warn Horatio. It was a brutal revelation, the kind that shattered trust and left only suspicion in its wake. The man who had tended their wounds, who had spoken of justice and healing, was the architect of their suffering. Footsteps creaked on the stairs outside, heavy and uneven. Paul appeared in the doorway, his revolver drawn, his face pale in the lamplight. Someone is coming, he hissed. We need to leave now. Before they could move, a shot boomed from the hallway, deafening in the small space. The lamp shattered glass, raining down like hail, plunging the room into shadows, lit only by moonlight streaming through the window. Horatio's foreman, Grit, drunk and jumpy, fired again from the doorway, trying to kill everyone and burn the evidence in one violent sweep, his face twisted with panic and rage. Maka lunged, slamming into Paul and dragging him behind the heavy desk as bullets chewed the doorframe, splinters flying like tiny spears. A jagged piece of wood carved a fresh line down Maka's already bruised arm, hot and stinging blood welling up immediately. The foreman charged in, waving his pistol wildly, his movements clumsy with drink. Lucas swung a ledger like a brick, catching the man across the skull with a sickening crack. Grit crashed to the floor, blood streaming from his temple, unconscious before he hit the ground. Paul stared at Maka, his breath harsh and fast, his hands shaking. You could have let that bullet take me. I have given you no reason to save me. I nearly killed you this morning. Maka shrugged, wincing as fresh agony flared through his arm. Bullet does not ask who you are. It just kills. And you chose not to shoot me when you could have. That means something. Paul stared at him for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, a breaking of old prejudice, a recognition of shared humanity. Then reached down and picked up the telegraph log from where Catherine had dropped it. He read the entry by the faint light of a lantern stub Catherine managed to relight with trembling hands. His face went slack, then hard as granite. He knew Joseph would die. Maybe wanted it, planned it all along. Insurance on the payroll land ready to buy, when folks are too scared to argue, too angry to think. His voice shook with fury and shame, each word dragged from somewhere deep. He tucked the telegraph log and the ledger page about Dr. Cole into his coat, along with 2 other pages torn from the financial records, his movements deliberate. "You want justice," he said, his voice hoarse. "You will need a judge, not a mob. But Horatio will not let you reach him. He will kill you all first and bury you where no one asks questions." The twist was clear, now laid bare in ink, and dates this had never been just a robbery or a random act of frontier violence. It was a staged martyrdom with old Joseph as the sacrifice and 4 immigrant girls as the scapegoats, all orchestrated by a man they thought was respectable and enabled by a doctor and they had trusted. The betrayal cut deeper than any bullet. They left through the back window, Paul covering their retreat, the foreman groaning on the floor behind them, the night swallowing them whole. At first light on Monday, September 20th, they headed toward the road, where a traveling territorial judge was expected, a man named Horace Whitfield, known for being hard but fair, who made his circuit through the territory every 6 weeks. The road ran east beyond Whirlwind Pass, a narrow stretch where canyon walls still loomed, but the land began to open toward flatter ground. Maka, Catherine, Paul, Lucas, and the 4 girls rode in one battered wagon, pulled by 2 borrowed horses, evidence wrapped in oilcloth and tucked under the seat, hearts pounding with hope and dread in equal measure. Dr. Cole drove the wagon, his face pale, his hands gripping the reins too tightly. No one had confronted him yet about the ledger entry, but Catherine watched him with cold, calculating eyes. She had positioned herself in the wagon bed in a way that allowed her to see his every move, her hand resting on a small Derringer pistol hidden in the folds of her skirt. The canyon walls rose around them, closing in like the jaws of a trap, the stone red and ancient. Maka's instincts prickled the same feeling he got before a storm or an ambush, a tightening in his gut. He scanned the ridges, seeing fresh rock fragments on the slope, loose stones scattered where boots had climbed recently, the earth disturbed. "Ambush," he said, his voice tight with certainty, but the warning came too late. Rocks thundered down from above, a deliberate avalanche triggered by men with crowbars, the sound like the world breaking apart. The lead horse stumbled, screaming in terror, its leg caught in the slide. The wagon lurched hard to one side, wheels groaning under the strained wood splintering. Juliana grabbed Sonia before she was thrown clear, her arms wrapping tight around her sister. Cordelia smashed into the sideboard, the breath knocked from her small body, her eyes wide with shock. Gunfire erupted from the ridges on both sides, bullets kicking up earth and splintering wood, the shots echoing off the canyon walls in a deafening cacophony. Horatio's riders' faces bare now, no need for masks. When they planned to leave, no witnesses rained lead down from cover, their rifles cracking in rapid succession. Paul fired back his revolver, barking, smoke rising. But they were boxed and exposed, easy targets like fish in a barrel. A bullet slammed into Maka's left thigh, the exact spot where the old scar and new wound intersected, tearing through flesh and muscle. Shock and agony exploded up his spine, white-hot and devastating, stealing his vision for a moment. His leg threatened to give out beneath him, the bone feeling like it might snap. "Out of the wagon!" he shouted through gritted teeth, dragging Cordelia from the wreckage with his good arm, his legs screaming with every movement, blood soaking his buckskin trousers. Catherine pushed the other girls toward the rocks at the base of the canyon wall, shielding them with her body, as splinters flew and bullets whined overhead, like angry wasps, her skirts tangling around her legs. The wagon overturned with a splintering crash, the false bottom breaking open under the impact. The damaged payroll chest tumbled free, spilling coins and papers into the earth, like a broken promise. Horatio himself rode into view from behind a boulder, his face flushed with triumph and rage, a pistol leveled at Maka's chest, his horse prancing with nervous energy. "Look at that!" he called, his voice carrying over the gunfire, dripping with satisfaction. "Caught with the money and the murderers. The judge will hear your confession from 6 feet under." Dr. Cole, thrown from the driver's seat in the crash, scrambled toward Horatio on hands and knees, his spectacles broken, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. "Horatio, please," he shouted, desperation clear in his voice. "You said no one else would be hurt. You said—" Horatio turned his expression cold and shot Dr. Cole once in the chest. The doctor collapsed, gasping, his hands clutching the wound. "You were useful, Abraham," Horatio said flatly, "but loose ends are dangerous." Catherine screamed, a sound of pure fury and betrayal. She had suspected Cole's involvement, but seeing him shot down like a dog tore something inside her. She raised the Derringer and fired at Horatio, but the small pistol's range was too short, the bullet going wide. Horatio's men closed in, dragging Catherine and the girls away, at gunpoint, rough hands grabbing at arms and hair. Paul dove for cover behind a boulder, pinned down beside Maka, bullets chipping stone inches from his head. Lucas dragged the dying Dr. Cole toward shelter as bullets chewed the road around them, fragments of earth and rock stinging their faces, choking them with grit. Cole coughed blood, his eyes glazing. "I am sorry." He gasped, his voice barely audible. "He had my note, my debts. I thought he would only scare Joseph, take the money. I did not know he would kill him. I did not know." "You knew enough," Lucas said bitterly, but his hands still tried to staunch the bleeding, the instinct to save a life stronger than his anger. Cole's eyes found Maka. "Old mine. Upper shaft. Dynamite. He plans to bury them." His breath rattled, and then he was gone. Horatio ordered his riders to haul the captives to the old upper mine above town, a place half abandoned, perched on a ledge above the roaring falls, perfect for burying evidence and people under rock, where no one would ever find them, where screams would be swallowed by the thunder of water. He snatched the scattered pages of the ledger from the earth, tucking them into his coat with a smug smile, and rode off with his men, leaving Maka, Paul, and Lucas bleeding and battered on the canyon floor, and the echoes of hooves fading Dr. Cole's body cooling beside them. Fragments of stone settled slowly, the echoes of gunfire fading into silence, broken only by the groans of the wounded. Maka tried to stand, but his leg buckled, and he dropped to one knee, teeth gritted against a scream that clawed at his throat. The wound was catastrophic, worse than before, the flesh torn, the bone possibly fractured. He could still move, but running was gone from him now, stolen by a bullet and his own stubborn refusal to quit. Paul met Maka's eyes, his face pale as parchment. "We are outnumbered, outgunned, and you can barely stand," he said, despair creeping into his voice like poison. "Cole is dead. The evidence is gone. How can we possibly—" Maka tore another strip from his shirt and bound his own leg with shaking hands, knotting it tight enough to make stars dance in his vision, the fabric soaked with blood, before he even finished. He looked up at the cliffs rising above them, at the distant roar of the falls echoing off stone like the voice of judgment. "Then we do not run," he said, his voice rough but steady, each word forced through clenched teeth. "We climb, and we end this." Lucas, his face streaked with Cole's blood, nodded grimly. "I am with you. My family will starve if Horatio lives. I have no choice." Paul checked his revolver, reloading with hands that no longer shook. "My brother would have wanted me to stand for what is right, not for what is easy. I am done running from that." They turned their faces up toward the ledge, and the mine mouth hanging over the crashing water, knowing the odds were impossible and going anyway, because there was no other choice, because 4 children's lives depended on it, because justice demanded it. The old upper silver mine sat on a narrow ledge carved from the cliff face above the falls, accessible only by a steep, treacherous path that wound up the rock like a serpent. Water thundered past below, throwing mist into the air, like ghostly hands reaching the sound so loud it swallowed voices and gunshots alike, a constant roar that filled the ears and rattled the bones. Inside the mine, rough-cut tunnels twisted through rock, held up by ancient wooden beams, some cracked, some sagging under the weight of stone accumulated over decades. The place smelled of damp earth, old explosives, and wrought the air thick and oppressive. Horatio shoved Catherine and the four girls into the main chamber, their wrists tied with rough rope that bit into skin. Old timbers groaned around them, the sound like bones, settling a constant reminder of the weight pressing down. He stacked crates of old dynamite near the entrance, the sticks sweating nitroglycerin in the damp air, unstable and deadly, each one a promise of obliteration. He planned to cave the shaft in and claim the girls had died hiding stolen payroll, while trying to blow up his mine in a fit of desperation and foreign madness. It would be a tragic story, a cautionary tale, and no one would question it because no one would dare. Dead-Eye Dick stood guard at the mine entrance, his revolver drawn, a cigarette dangling from his lips. He had killed 16 men in his career, and he planned to add several more today. His eyes scanned the approach, watching for any sign of pursuit. Back in town, Horatio had already roused another vigilante mob from the saloon porch before leaving for the mine. Waving the tattered ledger pages, he had not lost his voice ringing with false righteousness that echoed off the buildings. They killed old Joseph. He shouted to the crowd, his face red with manufactured fury. Now they tried to blow up the mine. We are riding up to finish this before any judge can be fooled by their lies and trickery. Men mounted horses, grabbed rifles, and rode hard for the falls, fury and fear driving them like whips, their voices raised in a chorus of vengeance. Phase 1. The climb up at the base of the cliff. Maka, Paul, and Lucas approached under heavy fire from Dead-Eye Dick and 2 other guards positioned on the ledge. Bullets whined past, ricocheting off stone, each impact sending sparks and fragments flying. Maka's leg was a constant source of torment, refusing to support his full weight, each step up the narrow path a battle won against his own body. He leaned on Paul's shoulder briefly, then pushed himself upright, pride warring with necessity. "I can carry you," Paul offered, his voice strained. "No," Maka replied through gritted teeth. "You need both hands for your rifle. I will manage." The path was treacherous, loose stones, narrow footholds, drop-offs that plunged hundreds of feet to the churning water below. Lucas climbed ahead, using his rancher's knowledge of terrain to find the safest route. Paul provided covering fire, his shots measured and deliberate, aiming to pin down the guards rather than expose himself unnecessarily. Halfway up, Maka's leg gave out completely. He collapsed against the rock face, gasping, his vision swimming with pain. For a moment he thought he could go no further. Catherine's voice echoed in his mind. "You did not have to step between me and that rope." "Yes, I did." He forced himself up, using his hands and one good leg dragging the injured one behind him. Each movement was agony, but he moved anyway because stopping meant death for Catherine and the girls. Dead-Eye Dick spotted them and shouted to his men. "They are climbing, pour fire on them." Bullets rained down closer now, more accurate. One struck the rock inches from Lucas's head, showering him with fragments. Another tore through Paul's coat, missing flesh by a hair's breadth. Paul fired back his shot, catching one guard in the shoulder. The man screamed and fell back from the ledge. Dead-Eye cursed and stepped forward, exposing himself to get a better angle. It was a mistake. Maka, despite the agony in his leg, drew his rifle with shaking hands and fired. The shot hit Dead-Eye in the thigh, spinning him around. The bounty hunter stumbled, but did not fall, his face contorted with pain and rage. "You are a dead man, Injun!" Dick roared, firing wildly. They reached the ledge just as Dead-Eye was reloading. Maka and Paul hauled themselves over the edge, Lucas right behind them. Deadeye raised his revolver, but Paul was faster. He fired twice the shots, echoing off stone. Deadeye staggered, blood blooming on his chest, his eyes wide with shock. He dropped his gun and fell to his knees. You are just a lawman." Dick gasped, blood bubbling from his lips. "You are supposed to be on our side?" "I am on the side of justice," Paul replied, his voice steady. "Something you never understood." Deadeye fell forward dead before he hit the ground. The second guard fled into the mine, shouting warnings. Phase 2. The fuse and the mine. Inside the mine, Catherine heard the gunfire and knew Maka had come, wounded leg and all. She worked at the ropes, binding the girl's wrists, her fingers slick with sweat and blood. Juliana's smaller hands helped both of them, ignoring the pain as the hemp cut deeper. Ancient beams groaned overhead, the sound ominous, threatening. Fragments of stone sifted down like snow, settling on their hair and shoulders. Horatio heard the shots and cursed. He struck a match with shaking hands and lit a long fuse jammed into a crate of dynamite propped against a central support post deep in the tunnel. The fuse was short, no more than 90 seconds, maybe less, designed to give him time to escape. But no one else. Either way, this story ends under rock. He muttered, his face twisted with rage and desperation, spittle flying. The fuse hissed and sparked smoke snaking into the tunnel, the smell of sulfur, sharp and choking. He turned and ran for the side exit, a narrow tunnel that led to a hidden path down the cliff. Maka, Paul, and Lucas burst into the main chamber just as the fuse disappeared around a corner, burning fast. Catherine pointed frantically. Dynamite. He lit the fuse. Maka assessed the situation in an instant. The fuse had maybe 60 seconds left. The chamber held Catherine and 4 children. The path out was choked with falling timber and loose rock from the earlier explosion. There was no time to carry everyone out. "Go!" he shouted to Paul and Lucas. "Get them out." "What about you?" Paul demanded. "I will cut the fuse. Now go." Paul hesitated, then grabbed Juliana and Sonia, pulling them toward the entrance. Lucas took Rosalie and Cordelia. Catherine refused to move. "I am not leaving you," she said, her voice fierce. "You must," Maka replied, his eyes meeting hers. "They need you. I need you to survive." It was the closest he had come to admitting what had grown between them, and the weight of it hung in the smoky air. Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded once and ran, following the others. Phase 3. The fuse. Maka turned and limped deeper into the tunnel, following the sputtering fuse. The passage narrowed, forcing him to crouch and then to crawl. His legs screamed with every movement, the wound tearing open, further blood soaking through the makeshift bandage. The tunnel floor was slick with seepage from the rock above, mud and water mixing into a treacherous slurry. The fuse burned ahead of him, eating the distance with terrifying speed. 40 seconds. 30. The passage became so narrow, he had to drag himself forward on his elbows, his chest scraping rock, his injured leg a dead weight behind him. Sweat poured down his face, mixing with the mud. His breath came in ragged gasps. 20 seconds. He could see the crate now wedged against the support beam, the fuse almost at the dynamite. He reached for his knife, but it had fallen from his belt somewhere in the crawl. He cursed in his native tongue, a string of words that would have made his mother weep. 15 seconds. He lunged forward, ignoring the screaming protest from his leg, and grabbed the fuse with his bare hand, yanking it from the crate. The flame seared his palm, the pain immediate and intense. But he held on, ripping the burning cord away from the dynamite and throwing it into a puddle of water where it hissed and died. For a moment, there was only the sound of water dripping and his own ragged breathing. Then, from deeper in the mine, a secondary fuse, one Horatio had set as backup, ignited with a muffled boom. The explosion was not large, but it was enough. The tunnel shuddered, timbers cracking, stone falling. A beam above Maka's head gave way with a splintering crash, and the tunnel began to collapse. He turned and crawled as fast as his body would allow, dragging himself through the mud and falling rock, his leg useless, his hands bleeding, his breath a fire in his chest. Behind him, the tunnel filled with rubble, the gap closing like a mouth. He burst from the narrow passage just as the entrance collapsed behind him, a wall of stone sealing it shut. He lay on the floor of the main chamber, gasping, covered in mud and blood, alive by the thinnest of margins. Catherine was there, pulling him to his feet, her face streaked with tears and soot. "You fool," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You beautiful, stubborn fool." Phase 4. Horatio's end aside. Horatio emerged from the side tunnel, confident that the mine had collapsed and buried his problems forever. He mounted his horse and turned toward town, ready to spin another story. Paul stepped into his path, revolver drawn. Lucas flanked him on the left, a rifle in his hands. Catherine and the girls stood behind them, witnesses to everything. The mob from town arrived at that moment, reining in their horses at the edge of the ledge, confusion on their faces. Paul held up the telegraph log and the ledger pages. Horatio Pike planned old Joseph's murder. He shouted, his voice carrying over the roar of the falls. He wired for insurance payment before the wagon left town. He paid Dead-Eye Dick. He bribed Dr. Cole for information. I have the proof right here. The crowd murmured doubt, spreading like wildfire. Horatio saw his carefully constructed world crumbling. He drew his pistol and fired at Paul. The shot went wide, striking a rock. Paul fired back, his bullet hitting Horatio's shoulder, spinning him in the saddle. Maka limped from the mine entrance, blood-soaked and battered, his face set like stone. Horatio saw him and fired again, the bullet hitting Maka in the ribs, glancing off bone but not penetrating deep. Maka staggered but did not fall. Catherine stepped forward, placing herself between Maka and Horatio, her skirts billowing in the mist from the falls. "You shoot again, you shoot through me," she said, her voice hard as iron. "And every man here will know you for what you are, a coward and a murderer." The mob flinched at the image of their schoolteacher standing defiant, protecting a Lakota warrior, shielding innocent children from a man they had trusted. Horatio's horse reared, panicked by the noise and the smell of blood. Horatio lost his grip and fell tumbling from the saddle. He hit the ground hard, his pistol skittering away. He scrambled toward the edge of the cliff, desperate to escape down the hidden path. Paul moved to stop him, but the ground beneath Horatio's feet, loose shale weakened by the mine collapse, gave way. He teetered on the edge arms, windmilling, his face a mask of terror. "Help me," he screamed, his voice cracking. Paul reached out instinctively, grabbing Horatio's wrist. For a moment he held the man's weight, the loose stones sliding beneath his own boots. Horatio's eyes met his, and in that instant, Paul saw no remorse, no regret, only rage that his plans had failed. Paul's grip loosened. He did not push. He did not have to. The weight was too much, the stone too loose, and Horatio fell, his scream swallowed by the roar of the water below. The mob stood in stunned silence. Then slowly they dismounted, lowering their weapons, shame written on every face. Judge Horace Whitfield arrived 3 hours later, summoned by a rider Paul had sent. The judge listened to testimony on the ledge above the falls, the roar of water a constant backdrop. Maka propped against a rock, his leg wrapped in Catherine's torn petticoat, and strips of his own shirt described what he had seen in Whirlwind Pass. Catherine recounted the hanging attempt, her voice steady despite the exhaustion etched in every line of her face. Juliana, speaking for her sisters, told of their hunger and fear, and of the 3 coins she had taken from the overturned wagon, a confession that brought tears to the eyes of several men in the crowd. Paul presented the telegraph log, the ledger entries, and his own testimony of willful blindness and the choice he had finally made. Lucas confessed his debts and his fear. Then, his decision to stand with those fighting for justice. The judge, a man of few words and less patience for lies, delivered his verdict on the spot. The four girls, Juliana, Rosalie, Sonia, and Cordelia, were innocent of robbery and murder. Any man who said otherwise would answer to the court. Old Joseph's death was a deliberate murder orchestrated by Horatio Pike for financial gain. Dr. Abraham Cole, though complicit, had paid for his betrayal with his life. His debts would be forgiven, his name recorded as a cautionary tale. Horatio Pike's holdings would be sold at auction. Debts to minors, to Lucas Moran, and to immigrant families would be paid first. Any remainder would fund a school and a proper courthouse. The hanging beam under the cottonwoods was to be removed and burned, the ashes scattered in the river. A formal apology was read into the record, though words could never undo what had been done. Dead-Eye Dick's body was buried in an unmarked grave outside town, his name stricken from memory. Mahka spent 3 weeks recovering in a small cabin by the river, built by grateful townsfolk who could not erase their guilt, but could at least offer shelter. Catherine tended his wounds daily, changing bandages, forcing him to rest when he tried to rise too soon. Their conversations grew longer, deeper, moving from practical matters to shared grief to the future they might build. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of fire, Catherine sat beside his cot, her hands folded in her lap. "I thought I would never trust anyone after my husband died," she said quietly. "I thought I had seen too much cruelty, too much loss." Maka studied her face, illuminated by the fading light. "And now I know that trust is not about never being hurt. It is about choosing to believe in someone despite the risk." He reached out his hand, covering hers. The touch was simple, chaste by the standards of any era, but it carried the weight of everything they had survived together. "I will not leave when winter comes." He said the words, careful, deliberate. "Not yet." Catherine's eyes shone. "Good." The girls healed in their own ways. Juliana took a job carrying mail along the river routes, learning old Joseph's roots from the postmaster, her sharp mind quick to memorize names and faces. Rosalie and Sonia helped Catherine in the schoolroom, their laughter filling spaces that had been silent for too long. Cordelia still woke with nightmares, still touched her neck where the rope had burned. But she also raced along the riverbank with other children, her small voice rising in defiant joy. Paul Gibbons turned in his badge permanently and took work as a ranch hand, his days spent in hard labor that slowly scrubbed the guilt from his conscience. He visited old Joseph's grave every Sunday, leaving small tokens, a letter, a carved horse, a promise whispered to the wind. Lucas Moran's debts were forgiven, his land secured. He built a small addition to his cabin, a room he offered to Juliana and her sisters for as long as they needed it. They accepted, and for the first time in months, Cordelia slept without fear. 2 months later, under an autumn sky painted in golds and crimsons, the cottonwoods that had once held a gallows beam, the shop. In the weeks that followed the trial, Willow Bend did not become a paradise, but it changed in ways that would have been unthinkable a year before. The gallows came down first. Men who had once shouted for blood now sweated in silence as they hacked at the uprights with axes. The heavy crossbeam thudded into the dirt, sending up a puff of dust that smelled faintly of old hemp and older fear. Catherine watched from a distance with the girls at her side. No speeches were made. No plaque was raised. The people of Willow Bend did not want to memorialize what the scaffold had been. They only wanted it gone. The noose that had waited for 4 small necks was cut apart and burned with the scrap lumber behind the livery. No one spoke while the rope blackened and curled in the flames. When the fire died, Maka took a shovel and scattered the ashes into the river. The current carried them away without ceremony. Life, stubborn as grass between wagon ruts, pushed forward. The schoolhouse that Catherine had dreamed of for so long finally stood near the cottonwoods by the river, its plank walls rough but solid, its windows letting in bands of pale light. The bell was nothing more than a cast-off iron triangle, but when Juliana struck it with a length of metal at first light, the clear ringing carried all the way to Main Street. Children came, sons and daughters of miners, shopkeepers, laundresses, cattle hands. They came in boots patched with rawhide and shoes worn thin in dresses, let out and let down in shirts that still smelled faintly of coal smoke or horse. Some came because their parents wanted them to read. Some came because their parents wanted them out from underfoot. A few came in defiance of fathers who muttered that books make folks forget their place. On certain mornings, other figures appeared on the rise above the river, Lakota women in calico and trade cloth. Their braids bound with strips of red cloth, children peeking shyly from behind their skirts. A handful of boys older than the rest stood at the edge of the yard, uncertain, as if waiting to be told to leave. Catherine met them at the steps. "If you wish to learn," she said simply, "this door is for you as much as for anyone else." The boys exchanged glances, then one stepped forward. Behind him, Maka inclined his head once in quiet approval. The boy crossed the threshold, the others following. In that small movement, something in the town's spine bent but did not break. Inside letters scratched their way across slates. English words shared space with Lakota ones. When Catherine pointed to the page of a primer and said, "River," Juliana would sometimes add, "Minishoshe," tracing the shapes with her finger. The younger children repeated both their voices, a rough, sincere chorus. Maka's limp never vanished. The wound he had taken in the canyon left his gait uneven and his legs stiff in cold weather. He carried a carved cottonwood stick, now more tool than ornament, its surface marked with simple, careful designs. Yet there was nothing diminished in the way he moved. He walked the length of the town with his head-high eyes steady, as if daring anyone to pretend they had not seen the day he had stood between a mob and 4 terrified girls. He spoke little, but when he did, people listened. Some evenings, he sat on the schoolhouse steps, mending a saddle strap or sharpening a knife. The girls would gather near running stitches through scraps of cloth or practicing letters on slates. Sometimes he told stories in Lakota, slow and measured, and Catherine would pause in her grading to listen, catching only fragments, but feeling the weight in his tone. Other times, he simply watched the river slide past its surface, flashing like coins in the late light. One afternoon, as the first frost silvered the grass along the bank, Juliana approached Catherine with a small bundle wrapped in a handkerchief. Her hands trembled, but her chin was set. "I need to give something back," she said. Maka, leaning against the schoolhouse wall, looked up. They walked together to the modest plot at the edge of town, where old Joseph had been buried. The grave was marked by a simple wooden board bearing his name, carved by a carpenter who had been paid in stew and gratitude. A few ragged wildflowers, long dried, clung to the earth near the base. Juliana knelt, unwrapped the handkerchief, and revealed a brass locket, its surface dulled from many days, hidden away. When she opened it, 2 worn miniatures stared up at them, a man and a woman in their Sunday-best faces, soft with hope. When the wagon overturned that night, Juliana said, her voice shaking but clear, everyone was shouting. Men were grabbing at the trunk. It burst open. The box with his coins spilled. I took the locket. I told myself that no one would miss it, that I deserved something for all the fear. But it was not mine. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she did not wipe them away. "He died because of a lie," she whispered. "I will not keep something that belongs to his story." Catherine crouched beside her. "You were a child, pushed beyond what any child should bear," she said softly. "But giving it back now, that is a choice only a brave girl makes." Maka took the locket in his hand. The metal was cold against his palm, heavier than it looked. For a moment he said nothing, his thumb running over the faint pattern on the front. "Old Joseph's body lies here," he said at last. "But his road keeps going with those who remember him." He dug a shallow hollow at the foot of the marker with the heel of his hand. Juliana placed the locket inside, then pressed the dirt back over it, smoothing the ground until no sign of the small grave within a grave remained. "I will remember him," she said, "and I will make sure no one forgets that he was good." Catherine laid her hand on Juliana's shoulder. Maka rested his palm lightly on the worn wood of the marker. "Justice is not something given by men like Pike," Catherine murmured. "It is something claimed piece by piece by people who refuse to look away." "Taken back," Maka added quietly. "Step by step, inch by inch." On the walk back toward the schoolhouse, the air carried the smell of wood smoke and the distant clatter of a hammer from a new frame going up along Main Street. The town was changing, not through proclamations, but through the slow work of doors, opened voices, heard burdens shared. Near the gate they heard the scrape of boots running over packed earth. Cordelia came pelting toward them, braids flying, face flushed with excitement. She nearly collided with Maka, stopping short at the last instant and clutching a folded paper to her chest. "There is a letter," she burst out. "A letter for you, Maka." He took it carefully. The paper was thick, the seal broken, but still clinging to the back in red crumbs of wax. The handwriting on the outside was precise, the ink a little faded from its journey. "It came on the morning stage," Cordelia said, bouncing on her toes. "Mr. Abernathy said it was from the capital. He said it looked important." Maka unfolded the sheet. Catherine stepped closer without thinking, her eyes scanning the neat lines as he read. The letter bore the crest of the territorial governor. It acknowledged the testimony given in the Pike case and the confusion that had nearly cost 5 innocent lives. It did not mention shame that was not the language of such men, but between the measured phrases ran a thin thread of discomfort. The governor wrote that men who knew the land and its people were needed if the territory were to avoid further misunderstandings that led to wasted blood and broken trade. He offered Maka a position as a scout and interpreter attached to the marshal's office with regular pay rations and the authority to speak in council on matters touching both settlers and the Lakota bands in the region. There was no promise of rights. There was no apology for treaties already broken. But there was an opening, a narrow, uneasy space, in which a single man might keep a few more children from swinging, a few more lies from hardening into rope. Catherine exhaled slowly when he finished, her breath clouding faintly in the chill air. "Will you accept?" she asked. Maka looked past the page to the camp along the river, to the curl of smoke rising from cook fires, to the faint shapes of teepees in the falling light. He looked at the schoolyard, where children chased one another, between lessons their laughter carrying over the sound of the water. He looked at Catherine herself, her dress dusted with chalk ink stains on her fingertips, eyes steady on his face. "If I ride with them," he said slowly, "I may keep some harm from finding my people before it reaches their doors. If I stay here, I watch over those who have already come under my shadow." "You have never had only one trail," Catherine replied gently. "You have always walked 2 at once." He folded the letter along its creases, the paper whispering. "I will go when they call," he said at last. "But I will not go far. When their road bends toward blood, I will turn my horse aside. Some paths are worth walking. Some must be refused." Cordelia blinked up at him. "Does that mean you are leaving?" Maka looked down at her, the faintest smile touching his mouth. "It means," he said, "that if they ask me to help them build another gallows, I will tell them no." Catherine's answering smile was small but bright. Then I hope they listen. That evening, lantern light spilled warm from the schoolhouse windows as the last of the day's chalk dust settled. Inside, Catherine checked slates and primers by the glow of an oil lamp, while the girls stacked benches. Outside, Mahka sat on the step, his carved stick resting across his knees, watching the sky darken from iron to deep blue. Fireflies winked among the reeds along the water's edge, tiny floating embers. On the opposite bank, shadows moved around distant fires, where Lakota families gathered their voices, carrying in soft threads of song and conversation. Now and then, the wind brought a faint burst of laughter from the town, someone telling a story too loud. In the saloon, a door slamming, a dog barking, and then growing quiet. Between those two clusters of light, the river kept its steady, indifferent course. Catherine stepped out and closed the door behind her, pulling her shawl tight against the chill. They were slow to leave today, she said, nodding toward the road. Some of the parents lingered. They watched the children from the camp walk beside their own. Did they speak? Mahka asked. Not much, she admitted. But they did not pull their children away. He considered this, then gave a small grunt that might have been approval. That is how new stories start, he said. Not with gunfire, with people who do not run. They walked together toward the riverbank. The grass whispered under their feet. Above, a scatter of early stars pricked through the deepening blue. Do you ever wish it had ended different? Catherine asked quietly. That someone else had stepped forward that morning, that you had not had to stand there alone. Mahka shook his head once. I was not alone, he said. You were there. The girls were there. The ones who chose to lower their rifles were there, even if their courage came late. He looked down at the water, its surface catching the last traces of light. There will be other days when men like Pike try to rule with fear. He went on. Other mornings when the crowd is ready to believe the worst of the ones who have the least. But now this town has seen that it does not always have to end that way. Catherine brushed her shoulder lightly against his arm in a gesture so small that anyone watching might have missed it. In that time and place, such touches were rare and all the more precious. And if it happens again, she asked, then someone must say what we said. Mahka answered. 2 words. She smiled faintly. Not today. He nodded. Not today. The sound of children laughing drifted across the darkening yard, and the 4 girls chasing one another in a game they had not had the freedom to play for years. Their voices rose and fell bright and sharp alive. They should have grown up as someone intended to hang them, Catherine murmured. Instead, they grow up as students. They grow up as themselves, Mahka corrected gently. That is better. The night settled in around them, cool and clear. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. The fires on both banks burned low, but they did not go out. In years to come, people would tell the story in their own ways. They would remember the morning when 4 girls stood on a platform with ropes around their necks and a Lakota warrior stepped between them and the crowd. Some would call it justice. Others would call it foolishness. But the children who learned to read in the little schoolhouse by the river would understand it for what it was, a moment when ordinary people, frightened and fallible, chose to say no to the easy cruelty of the day. They would carry that memory forward like a lamp on a dark road. And on nights when fear rose again, when rumors spread faster than truth, and someone whispered that hanging was the simplest answer, there would be voices in Willow Bend ready to answer with the words that had once changed everything. Not today, not amongst